Katherine Gypson for Insight. Today, I'm joined by William J. Dobson, a politics and foreign affairs editor at Slate and author of a new book, The Dictator's Learning Curve. William, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Your book looks at some of the ways today's dictators are adapting and changing to the environment and how they're different from the dictators of the Cold War. Can you tell us how they're different?
It's really never been harder to be a dictator. So if you're actually somehow able to keep your regime not just surviving but thriving, you're doing something right against all the forces that you sort of combat. And so for those that are more sophisticated, a little bit more intelligent about the ways they go about their repression, they find means that are more subtle forms of coercion. So for example, they control the media, but they allow just enough free expression so that there are outlets for people who have complaints who can air them and get something off their chest. It's also useful for the regime to actually know who's corrupt and who's not. And you can only do that with a little bit of an independent press. They devise laws that are broad and vague, but then they apply them like a scalpel against those that they deem a threat. So it's much more about finding ways to mask the regime, to create a facade that allows you to even claim, and they all do, claim to be Democrats.
You note that while Twitter and Facebook and YouTube are unprecedented means for revolutionaries to throw down these dictators, the dictators themselves are finding ways to adapt to social media. What are those?
They've found very effective ways of using Facebook or Twitter to find out who their opponents are. Much of these tools are about creating greater transparency, which is not really something that you should value too much if you're trying to lead a group of people to topple a dictatorship. It was interesting. I mean, I spoke to people that were active in Egypt, youth who were active in Egypt before the revolution and after. And beforehand, one of the biggest mistakes that they were making that they only realized later was that they were running their movements like microcosms, democratic microcosms, because they felt like if we aspire to democracy, we should act like Democrats from the beginning, until eventually they got advice from other revolutionaries who said, no, actually, you want to run your movement like a military and then get to the democratic moment, but that has to come later.
That's ironic. What are some of the other ways they've learned to adapt, the opposition members?
If you're looking at the political oppositions themselves, you have to go sort of country to country. In the case of Egypt, the political opposition was about as inept and ineffective as you could imagine. I mean, you could actually make a better case for the fact that the opposition had been so beaten down that they had become almost an appendage of Mubarak's regime itself. They were happy to sort of accept the scraps from the table that they were given, but they weren't really doing anything to innovate and think about how to challenge the regime in a new way. In a case like Venezuela, where you now have young leaders, late 30s, early 40s, who have realized that in their particular context, the past generation of political opponents, the professional opposition, was too removed from the public. So these are people who come out of the communities themselves. They are not just saying Chavez isn't the right answer. They're producing alternatives for people to actually find attractive. Their messaging has become much more sophisticated over this time, but it takes time to do that.
I'm curious about that. You mentioned that, getting the masses behind them. I think people watching the Arab Spring unfold on TV are wondering, would I be able to do that? Would I be able to go out on the street and risk my life? How does the opposition engineer that tipping point so that they get people out onto the streets?
Well, this is a very important point, which is that these things are never spontaneous. One group that I spent a lot of time with and interviewed for the book is a group that was active in bringing down Slobodan Milosevic in 2000, and they now go around the world training people how to challenge their own dictators. And one of the first things they'll say is, if you're spontaneous, you're dead. There's any spontaneous revolution, it might look like that on CNN, but there's actually an enormous amount of planning that went into that. And so what does that mean? That means over the space of maybe years, building up alliances and relationships with people in the police force, with people in the military, with small business owners, coming up with different strategies that make the regime react to you rather than you always being reacting to the regime. You need to begin to create small victories, mark them as such, publicize them, just like you would do if you were in any sort of social campaign, and then build on that and build momentum where people begin to think, you know what, I could actually have a better future in your world than I could have in this one. And so my apathy now is, it's just too costly to me personally. I want to live in that country that you're speaking of. But you have to, at the end of the day, you're only going to persuade people to do that. It's not going to be this mass moment where 3 million people all have the same idea.
Right.
That's not how it happens.
Where you suddenly decide to walk out onto the street.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah. You note that a lot of the Arab dictators survived the revolutions by deciding to use force against their own people. Curious about what the calculation is, the cost ratio where you decide, I am going to use force against my own people to stop this.
Yeah, I don't know that they know the answer themselves, to be honest. I mean, you know, in the case of Gaddafi, he chose that path and it did not work out well for him. The classic case right now is really Syria. And I think that it's a losing strategy in the long run. They may be able to preserve themselves for a short time, but their world is becoming smaller and smaller and more isolated. So I don't think the long-term prospect for a regime like Assad's is in any way positive. The one outlier, the one example which really sort of is separate from all the rest is China, where they chose to use force in 1989, and they didn't just rebound, they're enjoying the most powerful and influential moment in their history in the last 20 years. But that's sort of the exception to prove the rule.
Egyptian activists told you that they felt lucky to not live in a country as repressive as Tunisia. Can you talk a little bit about the process that brought down Ben Ali and what other dictators might be learning from his mistakes?
This was a country that actually the education levels were quite high. The schooling system, excellent. You had people with high degrees of computer literacy, and these people would then graduate having had their heads filled with ideas, and they'd find that there was no job waiting for them. You know, having people of that skill set, with those ambitions, with that level of education, sort of sit idly, was always going to be a recipe for disaster, particularly as the demographics of the country skewed in such a way that such a huge percentage of the country was under 30 years of age. But no, I think that if a dictator were to look at Tunisia today, they'd say, if you do aspire to have a first-class educational system and give people these skills, also give them passports so that they leave, go abroad, make their fortunes, and send their money, the remittances, back home to mom and dad. I mean, that was a revenue source that he never tapped. He was relying on European vacationers.
You wrote that after you traveled researching for this book that you remain optimistic about the prospect for democratic change. Why is that? I
became more optimistic because of the people I met. I mean, at the end of the day, these struggles are really not so much about one state versus another state. They're about the regime and the people that live under their tutelage. And this is a battle of people. And when I met the people challenging these regimes, I again came away thinking I would not want to be their opponent. These were not romantics. These were strategists. These were people who were, you know, had been made to think in ways every bit as sophisticated as the dictators themselves, except for they exhibit far greater creativity and ultimately have a much better message to tell.
Right. Well, thank you very much for joining me today. I enjoyed speaking with you.
Thank you for having me.